My boyfriend's sister told me she ran the house and I was just the girlfriend. She went nuts when we got engaged. I started dating my boyfriend Owen 2 years ago. We met at a friend's barbecue and talked for 3 hours straight about everything and nothing. He asked me out the next day and we've been together ever since. Owen is kind and hardworking and treats me better than anyone I've ever dated. He owns a 3-bedroom house he bought before we met. He worked overtime for years to afford the down payment and he's proud of what he built. The only complication in our relationship is his sister Noreen. She moved in with Owen 5 years ago after her divorce. She was supposed to stay for a few months while she got back on her feet. 5 years later, she's still there. She doesn't pay rent. She doesn't contribute to utilities. She occasionally buys groceries, but only things she likes. Owen lets her stay because she's his sister and he feels guilty that her marriage fell apart. I understood that at first. Family is important and I didn't want to come between them. But Noreen made it clear from the beginning that she saw me as a threat. The first time I stayed over at Owen's house, Noreen watched me like I was a burglar casing the place. She asked how long I'd been dating her brother. She asked what I did for work and how much I made. She asked if I had my own place or if I was looking to move in with someone. Every question felt like an interrogation. When I left the next morning, she told Owen I seemed nice, but something about me felt off. He told me about it later, thinking it was funny. I didn't laugh. Over the next year, Noreen escalated her behavior. She rearranged things after I cleaned. She cooked elaborate meals on nights Owen and I had dinner plans so he'd feel guilty leaving. She interrupted us constantly when we watched movies or talked in the living room. She knocked on his bedroom door at random hours with questions that could have waited until morning. She made sure I never forgot she lived there too. Owen asked me to move in after 18 months together. I was excited until I realized Noreen wasn't going anywhere. Owen said she just needed a little more time. He said she was almost ready to get her own place. He said I needed to be patient because she was family. I agreed to move in because I loved him and I believed things would work out. The day I brought my first box of belongings to the house, Noreen pulled me aside. Owen was outside getting more boxes from my car. She stood in front of me in the hallway and spoke quietly so only I could hear. She told me this was her house. She said she'd been here for 5 years and I was just the girlfriend. She said Owen might own the property, but she ran the household. She said I could stay in his bedroom, but the rest of the house was her territory. She said if I tried to change anything or push her out, she would make my life miserable. Then she smiled and walked away like nothing happened. I stood there holding a box of my books, trying to understand what just occurred. The next 6 months were exactly what Noreen promised. Miserable. She criticized everything I did. She complained that I used too much hot water. She said my cooking smelled up the kitchen. She rearranged the groceries I bought so I couldn't find anything. She took over the living room television every evening and refused to share. She told Owen I was messy even though I cleaned constantly. She told him I was rude to her even though I barely spoke to her. She cried to him about feeling pushed out of her own home, even though nobody was pushing her anywhere. Owen always defended me when we talked privately, but he never stood up to Noreen directly. He said she was sensitive. He said she was still recovering from her divorce. He said I needed to give her grace. I gave her 6 months of grace. Then I stopped. I started by reclaiming space. Noreen had spread her belongings throughout the entire house like she was marking territory. I gathered everything of hers that was in common areas and put it neatly in her bedroom. When she complained, I told Owen I was just organizing. He thought that was reasonable. She couldn't argue without admitting she'd taken over rooms that weren't hers. Then I started cooking dinner every night. Noreen used to cook whenever she wanted Owen's attention, but now I got there first. I made his favorite meals and had them ready when he got home from work. Noreen tried competing, but Owen said he felt bad eating twice. She had to eat her meals alone while we ate together. Then I took over household management. I created a chore schedule and posted it on the refrigerator. I included Noreen on the list because she lived there rent-free and should contribute something. She threw a fit and said I had no right to assign her tasks. I told Owen it was only fair since I was contributing more than her despite moving in 5 years later. He agreed and told Noreen she needed to help out. That was the first time he ever set a boundary with her. Noreen started slipping. She couldn't handle having rules. She skipped her assigned chores and I pointed it out calmly. She made passive-aggressive comments and I responded with aggressive politeness. She tried to get Owen alone to complain about me, and I made sure we spent most of our time together. I wasn't fighting with her. I was just taking up space she assumed was hers forever. The breaking point came when Owen mentioned we'd been talking about getting engaged. I heard Noreen's footsteps stop in the hallway outside Owen's bedroom. We'd been sitting on the bed talking about engagement timelines and what kind of ring I might like. Owen was smiling and relaxed in a way he rarely was when his sister was home. Then Noreen pushed the door open without knocking. Her face went completely white like someone had drained all the blood out of it. Then red flooded her cheeks and neck. She stood there breathing hard and staring at us. Owen started to say something, but she cut him off by storming into the living room. We followed her because the alternative was letting her destroy something. She spun around and pointed at me. She said getting engaged would be the biggest mistake of Owen's life. She said I was obviously just using him for his house. Owen tried to calm her down, but she started screaming. She said I'd already pushed her out of her own home. She said now I was trying to steal her brother completely. Owen kept saying her name in this quiet voice like he was trying to talk down a wild animal. Noreen ignored him and kept yelling about how I'd ruined everything and turned him against his family. I stood there and didn't say anything because I knew anything I said would make it worse. Eventually, she ran out of steam and locked herself in her bedroom. Owen looked at me with this helpless expression. I told him we'd talk about it tomorrow and went to bed. The next 3 days were worse than anything Noreen had done before. She played music at 2 in the morning, loud enough that the bass shook the walls. I'd just fall asleep and then some terrible pop song would start blasting from her room. Owen went to her door and asked her to turn it down. She said she couldn't sleep and needed the music to relax. The second night, I got up at 6 for work and discovered she'd used all the hot water. The shower ran ice cold no matter how long I waited. When I came out of the bathroom, Noreen was in the kitchen making coffee like nothing was wrong. She asked if I slept well. I said fine and left for work without breakfast. That afternoon, Owen called me and said Noreen told him I'd been saying cruel things about his family. He said he knew it wasn't true, but he wanted to check in with me. I asked what specifically I was supposed to have said. He got quiet and admitted Noreen wouldn't give details. She just cried and said I was mean to her when he wasn't around. I started keeping notes on my phone. I wrote down the time when the music started and stopped. I noted when the hot water ran out and when I saw Noreen afterward. I wrote down what Owen told me about her complaints. I didn't know exactly what I was documenting, but I knew I'd need proof eventually. 2 weeks later, Owen took me to our favorite Italian place downtown. We'd been there on our 3rd date and went back every few months. He seemed nervous during dinner and barely touched his pasta. When the waiter cleared our plates, Owen reached across the table and took my hand. He said he loved me and wanted to spend his life with me. Then he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds. I said yes before he finished asking. I wasn't going to let Noreen's manipulation control our relationship. We were both happy and excited talking about when we'd tell people and whether we wanted a long or short engagement. But I felt this tight knot in my stomach thinking about what came next. We drove home holding hands and making plans. Then we pulled into the driveway and I saw Noreen standing at the living room window. She was just standing there watching us. The curtain was pulled back and she had her arms crossed. Owen saw her too and his smile faded a little. I squeezed his hand and told him it would be okay. I didn't believe it, but I said it anyway. Owen wanted to tell Noreen right away. He said it wasn't fair to keep it from her. I suggested waiting until morning, but he insisted we do it that night. He asked her to sit down in the living room. I sat on the couch next to Owen and Noreen took the chair across from us. Owen told her we were engaged. For a second, Noreen just stared at us. Then she started crying. Not quiet tears, but huge sobbing gasps like she couldn't breathe. She said Owen was abandoning her just like her ex-husband did. She said I'd turned him against his own family. She said she had nowhere to go because she couldn't afford to live alone. Owen looked devastated. He moved to sit next to her and put his arm around her shoulders. He told her nothing had to change immediately. He said she could stay as long as she needed. My stomach dropped when he said it. I knew we couldn't keep living like this. Noreen kept crying and saying she didn't know what she was going to do. Owen kept reassuring her and promising things would work out. I sat there watching him comfort her and felt completely alone. After an hour, Noreen finally went to her room. Owen looked exhausted. I told him I was going to bed and left him sitting there in the dark. I waited until I heard Noreen's door lock before I went back to the living room. Owen was still on the couch staring at nothing. I sat down and told him we needed to have a serious conversation. He nodded but didn't look at me. I explained as calmly as I could that I wasn't moving forward with wedding planning while his sister lived here rent-free and treated me like an intruder. I said this was supposed to be our home and I didn't feel welcome in it. Owen got defensive. He said Noreen was going through a hard time. He said I needed to be more understanding. I asked how long I was supposed to wait. He didn't have an answer. I told him he'd been avoiding this confrontation for years and it finally caught up with him. I could see recognition in his eyes. He knew I was right even though he didn't want to admit it. He asked what I wanted him to do. I said he needed to set a timeline for Noreen to move out and actually stick to it this time. He said he'd think about it. I told him thinking wasn't enough anymore and went to bed. The following week, we started looking at wedding venues online. I'd bookmarked a few places and Owen seemed excited about a barn venue about an hour away. We scheduled a video tour for Saturday morning. Friday night, Noreen announced she was having the bathroom tiles replaced starting at 8 on Saturday. Owen asked if she could reschedule. She said the contractor was only available this weekend and she'd been planning it for weeks. I knew she was lying, but I didn't say anything. Saturday morning, we took the video call in Owen's car in the driveway because the hammering inside was too loud. The venue coordinator kept asking if everything was okay. After that, Noreen inserted herself into every decision. She'd walk by while we were looking at venues and comment that they looked too expensive. She told Owen that spring weddings were cursed because her marriage fell apart in April. She scheduled loud projects during every video tour we booked. When we looked at photographers, she said they all seemed overpriced. When we discussed catering, she said nobody would come if we didn't serve her mother's recipes. I stopped arguing with her and started writing everything down. I kept a detailed log with dates and times and exactly what she said or did. Owen needed to see the pattern in writing because he couldn't see it happening in real time. 3 weeks into our engagement, Becca came over for coffee. Noreen was at work or wherever she went during the day. Becca and I sat at the kitchen table and she told me about running into Noreen at the grocery store. Becca said Noreen was driving a nearly new car, something silver and expensive looking. I asked when this was and Becca said 2 days ago. I knew Noreen told Owen she couldn't afford a car and had to borrow his for errands. After Becca left, I started digging. I checked social media and found posts from Noreen's coworkers tagging her at a downtown office building. I looked up the company and saw they were hiring for her position with a salary range that made my stomach turn. She was making more than Owen. I tracked her spending based on things I'd seen her buy and calculated she had to have significant savings. She'd been perfectly capable of affording her own place for at least 2 years. When Owen got home, I showed him everything I'd found. I pulled up the job listings and the social media posts and my notes about her spending. Owen sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. He looked sick. He said he'd been working overtime for months to cover household expenses. She'd been playing helpless while building a savings account and driving a car nicer than his. Saturday morning, I woke up to voices in the living room. I came out and found Owen's parents standing there with Noreen. Tabitha and Nolan both looked at me with these tight, disappointed expressions. Noreen had clearly been crying. Tabitha started talking about family bonds and being more understanding. She said Noreen was going through a difficult time and I needed to show more compassion. Nolan said Owen had responsibilities to his sister that came before his relationship with me. They talked for about 5 minutes while I stood there in my pajamas. Then I held up one finger and went to get my folder. I'd printed everything out and organized it with tabs. I came back and calmly presented my documentation of Noreen's behavior. I showed them the log of sabotage attempts with dates and times. I showed them the evidence of her actual financial situation, including screenshots of her salary range and her expensive car. I showed them the timeline of escalating behavior from the day I moved in until now. Tabitha's expression changed as she read through the pages. Nolan got quiet and stopped looking at Noreen. I didn't say anything while they read. I just let the evidence speak for itself. When they finished, Tabitha looked at Noreen and asked if this was true. Noreen started crying again, but it felt different this time. More desperate than sad. She said I was twisting everything and making her look bad. Nolan asked about the job and the car. Noreen said that was private and none of their business. Tabitha gathered up the papers and told Owen they needed to talk as a family. I went back to the bedroom and left them to it. That night, Owen's best friend Leonardo came over for what Owen called a guy's night. I went to Becca's place to give them space. When I came home around 11, they were both still sitting at the kitchen table with empty beer bottles lined up. Leonardo saw me and said he should go. Owen asked him to stay. Leonardo looked uncomfortable, but he sat back down. He told Owen something he said everyone in their friend group had known for years, but nobody knew how to bring up. He described how Noreen destroyed Owen's previous 2 serious relationships through the exact same pattern. She'd manufacture crises right when things got serious. She'd play the victim and make Owen choose between his girlfriend and his family. She'd sabotage plans and create constant conflict until the women gave up. Leonardo said he watched it happen twice before I came along. He said he'd hoped Owen would see it this time, but Noreen's manipulation had gotten more sophisticated. Owen sat completely still, listening to his best friend explain that his sister had been controlling his personal life for years. Leonardo said everyone was afraid to say anything because they didn't want to cause family drama, but watching it happen again with me was too much. Owen didn't say anything for a long time after Leonardo finished. Then he thanked him for telling the truth and Leonardo left. Owen and I sat at the table in silence. The next morning, I laid everything out for Owen. I spread my documentation across the kitchen table next to the financial evidence and my notes from Leonardo's account. I explained the pattern of Noreen deliberately sabotaging his relationships to keep him focused on her. I showed him how she'd been capable of independence for years, but chose to stay and maintain control. I walked him through each piece of evidence and let him draw his own conclusions. Owen looked physically ill. His hands were shaking and his face had gone pale. He kept picking up different pages and reading them like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then something shifted in his expression. The guilt and confusion started changing into anger. Real anger. Not the frustrated helplessness I'd seen before. He said he needed to set a firm deadline for Noreen to move out. He said he needed to actually enforce it this time instead of letting her manipulate him into backing down. I asked if he was sure, and he said he'd never been more sure of anything. He said he'd wasted years enabling behavior that hurt both of them. He said it was time to stop. Owen called Noreen into the living room that evening, and I stood next to him because I wanted her to see we were united on this. She came in looking annoyed like we were interrupting her TV show, and sat down on the couch with her arms crossed. Owen took a deep breath and told her she had 60 days to find an apartment and move out. He said he would help with first month's rent and the security deposit, but the current arrangement wasn't working anymore and needed to end. Noreen's face went from annoyed to shocked to angry in about 3 seconds. She stood up and asked if I was behind this, if I'd been poisoning him against his own family. Owen said this was his decision, and he'd been thinking about it for a while now. Noreen switched tactics immediately and started crying. She said she couldn't believe her own brother was abandoning her just like her ex-husband did. She said she had nowhere to go and couldn't afford to live alone. Owen reminded her about her full-time job and the savings account I'd discovered. Her tears stopped pretty fast when she realized he knew about her money. She got cold then. Really cold in a way I'd never seen before. She told Owen he was choosing some woman he barely knew over his own sister who had been there for him his whole life. She said I would leave him eventually, and then he'd regret pushing away the one person who actually loved him. Owen's hands were shaking, but he held firm. He said the deadline was 60 days and that was final. Noreen looked at me with pure hate and said this wasn't over. Then she walked out and slammed her bedroom door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Owen sat down heavily on the couch and put his head in his hands. I sat next to him and put my hand on his back. I told him I was proud of him even though I knew how hard that was. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said he hoped he was doing the right thing. I said he absolutely was, and we'd get through this together. The next few weeks were tense, but Noreen seemed to accept the deadline. She started looking at apartments online and even went to see a few places. Owen started to relax a little, thinking maybe she understood this was necessary. I stayed cautious because I knew Noreen better than that by now. She was planning something. I just didn't know what yet. Then, with exactly 1 week left before the 60-day deadline, Noreen developed mysterious stomach pains. She came out of her room one morning, doubled over and groaning. Owen immediately wanted to take her to the emergency room. I watched her carefully and noticed she was peeking at Owen's reaction through her fingers while she groaned. They went to the hospital and spent 4 hours there. The doctors ran tests and found absolutely nothing wrong. Noreen came home with pain medication and a referral to see a specialist. She told Owen she couldn't possibly focus on apartment hunting while dealing with this health crisis. She said she needed to concentrate on getting better first, and then she'd resume looking for places. Owen looked torn, and I could see him starting to waver on the deadline. That night, after Noreen went to bed, Owen suggested maybe we should give her more time since she was sick. I looked at him and said no. I told him this was manipulation, pure and simple. I pointed out how convenient it was that this mysterious illness showed up exactly 1 week before she had to leave. I reminded him that the doctors found nothing wrong and that Noreen had peeked at him through her fingers to gauge his reaction to her groaning. Owen wanted to believe me, but I could see the guilt eating at him. What if she really was sick and he forced her out anyway? What kind of brother would that make him? I told him we weren't resetting the deadline for a medical emergency that only showed up when deadlines approached. Noreen went to the emergency room 3 more times that week. Each visit lasted hours, and each time they found absolutely nothing wrong with her. She came home with different pain medications and more referrals, but no actual diagnosis. She spent most of her time in her room groaning loudly enough for us to hear. Owen looked exhausted from worry and lack of sleep. I was exhausted from watching this obvious manipulation play out while Owen struggled with guilt. The deadline came and went. Noreen was still in the house claiming she was too sick to move. So Owen hadn't enforced the deadline, and I could see the pattern starting all over again. She manufactured a crisis. He backed down, and nothing changed. I couldn't do this anymore. I packed a bag one morning while Owen was at work and left it in my car. When he got home that evening, I told him I was moving out temporarily and staying with Becca until Noreen was actually gone from the house. Owen's face went pale. He asked what I meant, and I explained as calmly as I could. I said I loved him, but I wouldn't participate in this cycle anymore where boundaries got set and then dissolved the moment Noreen manufactured a crisis. I said I'd watched him back down from the deadline he set, and I understood why, but I couldn't stay and watch it happen again and again. Owen looked panicked. He said I couldn't leave, that we'd work this out together. I told him I wasn't breaking up with him, but I needed him to prove through actions that he was ready to prioritize our relationship. I said when Noreen was actually out of the house and staying out, I would come back. But until then, I was staying with Becca. Owen started crying and asked me not to go. I hugged him and said this was the only way he would actually follow through. Then I picked up my bag and left. I cried the whole drive to Becca's apartment. This was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew it was necessary. Becca opened her door and hugged me without saying anything. She'd been expecting this call for weeks. 2 days later, Owen showed up at Becca's apartment. I opened the door and he looked terrible. His eyes were red and puffy like he'd been crying for hours. His clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He looked exhausted and heartbroken and determined all at once. He told me he went through with enforcing the deadline despite Noreen's protests. He said he told her she had 1 week to be out, or he would start formal eviction proceedings. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he finally understood that enabling Noreen had hurt both of them and prevented her from building her own independent life. I asked if he was sure, and he nodded. He said losing me made him realize he'd been choosing his sister's comfort over our future for too long. He said he was done making that choice. I hugged him tight and felt him shaking. I told him I knew this was incredibly hard and that we'd get through the aftermath together. He held on to me like I might disappear if he let go. We stood in Becca's doorway holding each other while he cried. Becca gave us some space and went to her room. Owen told me everything that happened after I left. How Noreen's mysterious stomach pains disappeared the moment he told her the deadline was final. How she screamed at him for hours about what a terrible brother he was. How she called their parents and told them he was forcing her onto the streets while she was sick. How he stood firm anyway because he couldn't lose me. I told him I was proud of him and that this was the right thing even though it felt awful. Noreen's final week in the house was a nightmare. She stopped pretending to be civil and went straight to destruction. I came back to help Owen deal with the situation and immediately regretted it. The first thing I noticed was the smell of bleach coming from the laundry room. I opened the washing machine and found all my clothes soaked in pure bleach. Every single piece was ruined, covered in white spots and holes where the bleach ate through the fabric. Months of my wardrobe destroyed in one spiteful act. I showed Owen and he looked sick. Then we found the scratches in the hardwood floor. Deep gouges carved into the floor of the master bedroom like someone had taken a key or a knife and deliberately dragged it across the wood over and over. The scratches formed words. She'd carved traitor into the floor in letters 2 feet tall. Owen stood there staring at the damage to his house, the house he'd worked overtime for years to afford. The destruction went beyond my clothes and the floor. She'd smashed several dishes that belonged to Owen's grandmother, family pieces that had been passed down for generations. She left them broken on the kitchen counter where we'd find them. She poured something sticky down the bathroom drain that clogged it completely. She put holes in the walls of her bedroom. She broke the lock on the back door. Every day brought new damage and new evidence of how much she hated us. Owen documented everything with photos. He walked through the house taking pictures of each destroyed item and damaged surface. I watched him photograph his grandmother's broken dishes and saw something change in his face. For the first time, he looked genuinely angry at his sister rather than just disappointed or guilty. He said she'd crossed a line from manipulation into actual malicious destruction. He said this wasn't grief or fear anymore. This was deliberate cruelty meant to hurt us as much as possible. The week ended and Noreen refused to leave. She locked herself in her room and said she wasn't going anywhere. Owen stood outside her door and told her she had 1 hour to start packing or he was calling the police. She screamed that he wouldn't dare. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. She opened the door then and looked at him like she didn't recognize him. He told her the deadline had passed and she was trespassing in his house now. She said fine and went back in her room. But she still didn't pack. Owen went to the county courthouse the next morning and filed formal eviction paperwork. The clerk explained the process would take at least another 30 days and cost several $100s in legal fees. Owen signed everything and paid the fees without hesitation. He said he should have done this months ago instead of hoping Noreen would leave voluntarily. The clerk gave him a court date and instructions for serving Noreen with the eviction notice. Owen drove home and handed Noreen the papers himself. She read them and laughed. She said he was really going to drag his own sister to court over this. He said yes, he was. She told him their parents would be ashamed of him. He said they already knew everything and supported his decision. That made her stop laughing. She asked what he meant, and he said Mom and Dad knew about the destroyed property, the manipulation, and the refusal to leave. She went pale and locked herself back in her room. Over the next few days, Noreen started calling everyone she knew. She told her friends that Owen was kicking her out on the streets while she was sick. She told distant relatives that I'd stolen her brother and turned him against his family. She posted vague messages on social media about betrayal and family bonds. She carefully left out every detail about her behavior, her financial capability, and the destruction she'd caused. Some people believed her version and sent Owen angry messages. Others asked for his side of the story and stopped talking to Noreen when they heard the truth. The family drama spread wider than our house, and I felt guilty about that, even though none of it was my fault. My phone rang one afternoon and I saw Tabitha's name on the screen. My stomach dropped because I assumed she was calling to yell at me for breaking up her family. I answered and she asked if we could meet for lunch without Owen or Noreen present. I agreed cautiously and we met at a quiet restaurant the next day. Tabitha looked older than the last time I'd seen her, tired and sad. She ordered coffee and then apologized. She said she was sorry for initially taking Noreen's side and not understanding what was really happening. She explained that she and Nolan had been enabling Noreen's dependence since her divorce, because they felt guilty about her failed marriage. She said they thought they were helping her heal, but instead they'd been preventing her from moving forward with her life. She said watching Owen finally set boundaries had made them realize they needed to stop rescuing Noreen from the natural consequences of her choices. I didn't know what to say. I'd expected anger or blame, not an apology and self-awareness. Tabitha said she'd talked to Owen about everything, seen the photos of the destruction, and understood why the eviction was necessary. She said she and Nolan would help Noreen with moving costs, but they supported Owen's decision completely. She said she hoped I could forgive them for not seeing the situation clearly earlier. I told her there was nothing to forgive, and that I was just glad they understood now. We talked for over an hour about family dynamics and enabling and how hard it is to see manipulation when it comes from someone you love. Tabitha hugged me before we left and thanked me for not giving up on Owen. She said he needed someone strong enough to help him break the cycle. Nolan went to see Noreen a few days later. Owen told me about it afterward because Noreen called him screaming right after their dad left. Nolan sat down with Noreen in her room and told her that he and Tabitha would help her with moving costs, but they supported Owen's decision completely. He said they'd watched her manipulate Owen for years, and they were ashamed they didn't intervene sooner to encourage her independence. He said enabling her had seemed kind, but it had actually been cruel because it prevented her from building her own life. Noreen apparently told him he was choosing Owen over her just like everyone else was, Nolan said he was choosing what was healthy for both his children, even if Noreen couldn't see that yet. He said he loved her, but he wouldn't help her avoid the consequences of her choices anymore. Noreen told him to get out. But Owen said something shifted in her expression when she realized her parents weren't taking her side this time. Her usual support system had collapsed, and she was finally alone with the results of her own behavior. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 93 days after Owen first told Noreen she needed to leave. 3 months of manipulation, destruction, legal proceedings, and family conflict all leading to this moment. Professional movers loaded Noreen's belongings into the truck while she supervised without looking at either of us. She'd found a 1-bedroom apartment across town, paid for partially by her parents and partially by her own savings, that she'd finally admitted existed. The movers worked efficiently, and within 3 hours, everything she owned was packed and loaded. Noreen got in her car without saying goodbye. She pulled out of the driveway and the moving truck followed her. Owen and I stood there watching both vehicles disappear down the street. The house was finally ours. Just ours. No more Noreen watching our every move. No more manipulation or sabotage or constant tension. Owen started crying. Not sad crying or happy crying, but this complicated mix of relief and grief and guilt all happening at once. He'd reclaimed his home but lost his relationship with his sister in the process. He'd done the right thing, but it still hurt. I held him in the driveway while he processed everything. His whole body shook and he cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry before. I didn't say anything, just held him and let him feel whatever he needed to feel. Eventually he stopped shaking and pulled back. He looked at the house like he was seeing it for the first time. He said it felt different already, lighter somehow. I said that's what freedom felt like. The next 2 weeks were hard for Owen in ways I hadn't expected. He kept second-guessing himself and wondering if he'd been too harsh. He'd check his phone constantly to see if Noreen had texted. He'd suggest maybe we should drive by her apartment to make sure she was okay. He'd wake up in the middle of the night worried that she was struggling and needed help. The guilt came in waves and sometimes pulled him under completely. I reminded him gently each time that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, and that Noreen was a capable adult who needed to build her own life instead of living in his shadow. I said she'd been perfectly capable of independence for years, but chose dependence because it was easier and gave her control. I said letting her face the natural results of her choices was the kindest thing he could do for her long-term growth. Owen listened, but I could see him struggling to believe it. One particularly bad night, he said maybe we should invite her over for dinner, start rebuilding their relationship. I asked him if he thought she was ready for that, or if he was just trying to ease his own guilt. He admitted it was probably the guilt. I suggested we start couples counseling to work through the family dynamics and strengthen our communication skills. Owen agreed immediately, like he'd been waiting for me to suggest it. We found a therapist who specialized in family systems and boundary setting. Our first session was the following week, and it helped more than I expected. Just having a neutral third party validate that Owen's boundaries were healthy and necessary seemed to lift some of the weight off his shoulders. The first project we tackled was the master bedroom. Noreen had chosen the paint color years ago, this dull beige that made everything feel dark and cramped. Owen and I spent a Saturday afternoon at the hardware store picking out paint samples. We settled on a soft gray blue that made the room feel bigger and brighter. I painted while Owen pulled up the damaged flooring she'd scratched during her final week. We replaced it with new hardwood that matched the rest of the house. We moved the bed to a different wall and brought in a dresser from my old apartment that I'd kept in storage. Owen hung photos of us on vacation and with friends. By the end of the month, walking into that bedroom felt completely different. The space didn't hold any trace of Noreen's anger or the tension that used to fill every corner. Owen started sleeping better. He stopped waking up at random hours checking his phone for messages from her. I caught him smiling while folding laundry one afternoon and asked what he was thinking about. He said he was just happy to be home, really home, for the first time in years. We tackled the living room next. Noreen had arranged all the furniture to face the television she'd monopolized every evening. We moved the couch to create a better conversation area and added a reading chair by the window. I brought in plants and Owen built shelves for our books. We replaced her heavy dark curtains with lighter ones that let in more sun. The house started feeling like it belonged to both of us instead of being Noreen's territory that Owen happened to own. We cooked together in the kitchen without someone hovering and criticizing. We watched movies on the couch without interruptions. We had friends over for dinner without worrying about Noreen making everything awkward. The house felt lighter, calmer, like we could finally breathe properly. 2 months after Noreen moved out, Owen's phone buzzed during breakfast. He read the message and his face went carefully neutral. He handed me the phone so I could see. Noreen was asking if he wanted to meet for coffee. The text was different from her usual demands. She asked instead of telling him what to do. She suggested a coffee shop near her apartment instead of expecting him to come to her. She said she understood if he wasn't ready, but she hoped they could talk. Owen looked at me and asked what I thought. I told him it was his decision, but I wouldn't be upset if he wanted to see her. He texted back suggesting Thursday afternoon. Owen met Noreen at a small coffee shop across town. I stayed home and tried not to check the clock every 5 minutes. He was gone for almost 2 hours. When he came back, he looked tired but not upset. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me what happened. Noreen apologized. actually apologized without making excuses or blaming anyone else. She said losing control of his house forced her to look at herself honestly for the first time since her divorce. She'd been using him as a crutch and manipulating him to keep from facing her own life. She said she started seeing a therapist who helped her understand how dependent she'd become. She admitted she'd been horrible to me and to him. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted him to know she was working on herself. Owen told her he appreciated the apology, but needed time before they could rebuild any kind of relationship. He made it clear he wouldn't go back to their old dynamic where she controlled his life. Noreen said she understood. They agreed to have coffee again in a month if Owen felt ready. Wedding planning became easier without Noreen sabotaging everything. We looked at venues without someone criticizing every option. We chose a date in early October when the weather would be nice but not too hot. We booked a small garden venue that held about 80 people. Owen's parents were supportive and helpful. Tabitha took me shopping for my dress and we actually had fun together. She told me stories about Owen as a kid that made me love him even more. She apologized again for not seeing Noreen's behavior sooner. She said she and Nolan had enabled both their children in different ways and they were trying to do better. We invited Noreen to the wedding. Owen wanted to extend the invitation as a gesture of moving forward. I agreed because I could see it mattered to him. Noreen accepted with a text that sounded genuinely happy for us. She didn't ask to be involved in planning or try to insert herself into decisions. Owen and I set clear boundaries about her role. She could attend as a guest, but we weren't asking for her input or help. Tabitha became my main helper with wedding preparations. She had good taste and respected my opinions. She and I grew closer over the months of planning. I started to feel like I had a real relationship with Owen's mother, separate from all the drama with Noreen. Our wedding day arrived on a perfect October afternoon. The garden venue looked beautiful with fall flowers and warm sunshine. Noreen showed up on time wearing an appropriate dress. She congratulated us and didn't create any scenes, but I could feel the tension underneath everything. She stood apart from the family during photos. She left the reception early without saying goodbye to everyone. Owen's parents looked sad even while celebrating with us. I knew they were mourning the family harmony that might never fully return. I was genuinely happy walking down the aisle toward Owen. I meant every word of my vows. But I also knew our family dynamics would never be simple or easy. Noreen would always be Owen's sister. There would always be some level of complicated history and careful boundary management. We'd fought for our relationship and won, but the victory was messy and painful. Standing at the altar holding Owen's hands, I felt satisfied knowing we'd made it through the hard parts together. We were stronger for everything we'd survived. Our relationship wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was real and complicated and worth every difficult moment.